Good evening, and welcome back once more. Tonight, we return to the very dawn of recorded history, to the lands between the Tigris and the Euphrates, where the world's first great civilization arose. This is the story of the Sumerians, a people who gave us writing, the wheel, law, mathematics, and some of the oldest myths known. Their cities rose upon the Mesopotamian plain more than 5,000 years ago, and from there came ideas and inventions that shaped all civilizations to follow. As always, I wonder, where are you listening from? And what time is it for you? Have you come to unwind after a long day, or to let your thoughts drift into the distant past? However it may be, I'm glad you are here. Now, let us begin. Where two restless rivers met, where brown water curled and eddied, and the wind whispered through the reeds, the earth invited people to remain long before the names Sumer and Akkad were spoken. Families gathered on low islands and levees of southern Mesopotamia, shaping banks of clay with their hands, testing soil with seed, and learning the moods of flood and drought. The land itself taught patience. When the Tigris surged, swift and fierce, it could strip a village to its roots. When the Euphrates wandered and left backwaters, fish filled the pools and birds crowded the sky. Between river and marsh, a long conversation unfolded, and people learned to listen. The first known settlers of these southern lands are called by archaeology the Ubaid people. Hard-working folk, they came here between the 6th and 5th millennia before the Common Era, leaving behind houses of packed clay. Hearths still darkened with ash, and bowls were painted in calm greens and browns. They were not kings or heroes, but farmers, fishers, and herdsmen who brought order to a difficult plain. They sowed barley and emmer wheat on natural rises just above the flood. They kept sheep and goats on dry edges, cattle where pasture met water. They planted date palms whose fruit fed the household, while trunks and fronds became beams, mats, and rope. They cut channels from river to field and learned when to close them, for too much water was as cruel as too little. Their labor was a quiet wonder, repeated season by season. It was an early mastery of irrigation that turned swamps into gardens. Clay was both gift and teacher. There was no fine stone for carving here, no tall forests to fell. There was river mud and sunlight. From this simple abundance, they shaped walls and thresholds, floors and jars for storage, stands for offerings, and small human figures with wide eyes and careful hands. They discovered clay would take a seal and carved simple stamps to mark jars and sanctify contents. They found that clay could hold a sign with perfect memory. In time, that memory would become writing. But first, it appeared as tokens and tallies, small fired pieces sealed in envelopes to reckon flocks and sacks of grain. Even before the first signs were scratched onto tablets, the urge to count and the duty to account were awake in this land. Water set the rhythm of life, and boats made the plain one country. The Ubaid people built light craft from reeds bound tight and sealed with bitumen drawn from earth that bled black. These boats carried fish, grain, and jars along rivers and canals and bore messages between settlements. Shards of painted Ubaid ware are found far along the Gulf Coast and on islands beyond the delta, traces of journeys by skilled seafarers who read wind, current, and stars. Trade began as neighborly exchange, then grew into water roads that carried copper from mountains, shells and stone from distant shores, and ideas that could not be weighed, yet changed life. Villages took shape according to the logic of labor. Houses were low and broad, often with a central room for family life, with storage chambers around and verandas catching the evening breeze. Walls were whitewashed against heat and glare. In the courtyards stood ovens and grindstones, where women ground grain and baked bread, while jars of fermenting beer gave a sharp, comforting scent. On the outskirts, kilns burned and cooled, where potters shaped vessels on slow wheels. Loom weights and spindle whirls show flax and wool were spun and woven into cloth. Strong for work, fine for rites. The village was a weaving of many crafts into one life. Order, once found, bred new order. Fields demanded timely watering. Canals had to be opened and cleared. Levees repaired before the flood. One household could not manage alone. A settlement learned to act as one when water was at stake. Elders and overseers arose, not as rulers, but as keepers, able to gather people to clean canals and set calendars of work. Where seed, water, and labor were invested, harvests had to be guarded and counted. Granaries appeared, and with them, guards and careful recorders, remembering how many sacks were owed and how many delivered. The balance between family and community was fine, but in time, habit became custom, and custom, law. Religion grew from the same soil as irrigation and account. People of marsh and levee lived beside forces that seemed to think and speak. Beneath the ground ran fresh water, bursting into sweet springs. The river rose when no rain fell on the plain. Fish, reed, and date palm were gifts that sustained life. Gratitude took form in offerings within special rooms of the village. These rooms were built higher and broader, laid to a plan with meaning. The first shrines were not yet towers, but stood at the heart of settlements as houses of presence, where the community gave thanks to powers that held water and bread. An elder might be the keeper, or a woman with strong voice poured the first cup of wine. In such simple rites, priesthood was born. But the plain taught not only gentleness. The Tigris could cut a new bed in one season and leave dead water where harvest was expected. Salt rose through soil with poor watering and showed itself as pale crust, killing wheat. Marshes nursed malaria that woke in summer. Life here was balance between gift and threat. This discipline shaped the people. They became careful keepers of records, watchers of time and sky. They learned that time had body and pulse and counted its steps. From this came the first calendars, tuned to the dance of moon and flood. From this, the habit of measurement that would one day divide hour and circle into 60 parts. Though such refinements lay ahead, already a pattern formed. Villages gravitated towards centers that stored and distributed food and goods. These centers gathered labor at sowing and harvest, in digging canals and mending levees. Here, offerings were brought and feasts held to reconcile neighbors after quarrels. A family could win renown by generosity and leadership, becoming the voice of the community in disputes over water. The first hierarchies grew slowly. They were not palaces, but obligations, debts, feasts, and the habit of turning to a certain house for judgment. All was accompanied by the sense, half practical, half sacred, that the land between the rivers was a special creation. Each furrow held silt borne by floods from distant mountains. Each jar of grain was the end of a long journey begun as snow. The Ubaid may not have spoken it so, but their life declared it. They settled places that later became Eridu, Ur, and Uruk. Season by season, they learned to live where water was master and clay was bread, house, and writing. So the awakening began Without banners, without trumpets, a woman planted seed and watched water creep along the furrow, trusting barley would rise. A man mended his boat at dawn, eager to reach his traps. A child pressed a seal into soft clay and laughed at the imprint. Small acts, yet from them grew the first cities. From them came shared calendars, storehouses, and the first houses devoted to a god. The plain between rivers did not merely accept people, it remade them. On a low rise at the edge of marsh and stream, where fresh water sprang, the Sumerians later pointed and said, "Here kingship first descended from heaven." They called that place Eridu. To them, it was not only a city, but a beginning. In their lists, the first kings bore crowns with impossible years. Alulim ruled an age, then Alagar and others, more legend than ledger. The tale told the same as the land itself. Before palaces and courts, there was a sacred house, and around it, a settlement grew. Eridu began as a shrine of reed and clay, raised above the damp. The first sanctuary was small and neat, a central chamber with a niche, an altar, and a table for offerings at the wall. The plan was simple, a long room with side cells. Later builders raised temple upon temple on the same ground, lifting floors, thickening walls, enlarging the platform. One shrine lay upon another, like rings of an old tree. When the last storm covered its threshold with dust, the mound that buried these houses of gods became a book of time. Beneath one floor lay another, beneath one wall the trace of a former wall. At the foundation lay only reed and packed earth, memory of the first faith. The god of Eridu was Enki, lord of the underground waters. His house was called Abzu, the house of the deep. Later hymns praise him as keeper of wisdom, patron of craft, kind and cunning, giver of gifts to humankind. In the south, the greatest gift was water, and water obeyed Enki. It was no accident the first temple of the plain rose above a spring. Here pilgrims came with jars of barley and baskets of fish, poured libations, and left figures with wide open eyes. They prayed for steady floods, clear canals, and healthy children. The god was master of the city, his temple his house, and the people his household. The temple turned labor into order. Canals had to be dug and kept clean. Gates opened and closed on time. Dikes mended before the river grew wild. No family alone could hold back the water. The shrine became the circle's center of duty. Fields near Eridu were said to belong to the god. Families worked them and brought part of the grain into the storehouses of sacred ground. Fishers and reed cutters did the same with their catch and bundles. Herds grazed on temple pastures. Looms turned temple wool into cloth. In return, the temple gave out rations: barley, beer, oil. Later this would be written on tablets, but the custom was older than script. The shrine kept count with memory and with things. Clay tokens and sealed envelopes were the first quiet writing of temple economy. The buildings of Eridu bore the mark of lasting craft. The first walls were of clay, straightened and bound with reeds. Later they grew thicker, with projections and niches, first steps toward the facades of future ziggurats. Floors were often covered with a new coat of plaster, renewal of holiness. Low platforms for gifts stood where the light fell best. Walls bore simple bands of paint. Builders kept to the axis. The entry led straight to the god's niche. With every rebuilding, the shrine rose higher. Its platform stood above the houses. From the marsh's edge, a traveler saw white walls, processions, heard the chanting of priests. The temple taught the village to look upward and gather. The storehouses of Eridu and its festivals became the pulse of life. At harvest, grain was brought and laid in granaries. On feast days, the doors opened, and elders, workers, overseers received their shares. Beer was brewed, bread baked, meat roasted. Poor and strangers stood beside landowners. To live in the god's city was to share his gifts. The feast not only fed, it reminded each one of bonds beyond the family. It turned work into right, right into law. Year by year, custom narrowed into rule. From rules rose the first civic power. There's witness that the temple directed not only fields, but also craft. Eridu clay gave vessels known across the south, green and brown designs, stern and skilled. Potters had learned to spin the wheel faster. The kilns grew ever hotter and steadier. Bitumen sealed jars against water and the hulls of boats against marsh damp. Here are traces of early copper, gathered in far hills and chipped into small tools and ornaments. Shells from distant coasts became beads and inlays. The temple was not only shrine, but market. It called people from other villages to bring obsidian blades, colored stone, rare woods. In return, it sent fish, dates, crafted wares. The god's house stood at the crossing of gift and price. Here they kept lists and stored measures. Priests of Eridu were servants in the most practical sense. They herded labor as they herded sheep. They judged quarrels over water and land. They kept calendars. In a land where months are born of the moon, keeping time rightly was an act of power. When to summon people to clear the main canal? When to let farmers open side cuts to their fields? When should the shrine receive first fruits? Each answer began in the temple. The chief keeper and his aides named the days. What began as a work schedule became a sacred round of rites. And this round taught people to think of themselves as a city. From Eridu, the idea of a temple city spread to to Uruk, to Lagash, where shrines rose on high ground. Their tripartite halls and axial plans echoed models first seen here. The god's house was not only a place where heaven touched earth, it became the organizing mind of early city life. Within its walls, craft found order. Here food was stored and weighed, and youth learned measures a scribe must know. In the first days, the temple held no spears or helmets. It held plumb lines and rope baskets. From these ropes came straight walls and level floors, and with them the habit of precision that would one day yield written numbers and written words. People kept all this in memory of tales. When they spoke of the time before the flood, they named Ur first. When they told how wisdom came, they spoke of the gift of Enki, who sits in the depths and sends counsel through springs. Stories grew with the city, and each new rebuilding of the temple added weight to old claims. The shrine was ancient because the ground beneath it was ancient, and rites were true because they had been done there since forefathers' forefathers. In a land without stone, time was built of clay. The layered platforms and shrines of Eridu turned clay into memory. By late Ubaid times, Eridu looked a true center. The holy house stood high on its platform. The court below was paved and kept clean. On one side stretched granaries, on another pressed workshops. Gates opened to the canal, where reed boats came in with cargo and went out with gifts for allied shrines. Beyond the sacred district, houses lined in tidy quarters, and streets were packed by thousands of feet. Fields stretched to the horizon along straightened canals. This was not yet a kingdom, It was a community under the gods' rule, steady and rich enough to imagine more. From such imagining, the next step was born. The temple taught people to assemble. Its schedule taught them to live by common time. Its stores taught them to count and trust records. Its court taught them to stand before a power greater than the household. From these lessons, the first cities were born. From Eridu, the idea rose up the river to the place that would outgrow its teacher and give the world a new order. When the southern plain learned to think in cities, it spoke a name, Uruk. Today, the ancient mounds are called Warka, but in the 4th millennium before the Common Era, this place was already a net of canals and wharves, workshops and shrines, with kiln smoke shimmering above whitewashed walls. The city did not rise in a single season. It thickened and grew through centuries of rebuilding. Archaeologists speak of levels of Uruk as if chapters. Early Uruk begins about the 39th to 38th centuries BCE. Middle runs from the 38th to the 35th. Late from the 34th to the start of the 32nd. Each level left its marks in brick and clay. By the end of this long growth, the settlement covered hundreds of hectares and likely held tens of thousands of people. Such density the world had never yet seen. Uruk formed around two great sacred quarters. On one rise stood the district of An, the high god of heaven. Its crown in the late period of Uruk was a shining white temple on a stepped platform, which scholars call the White Temple. Beneath lay the massive core of Anu's terrace, built of millions of molded bricks and faced with gypsum. On another rise, to the southeast, spread the district of Eanna, devoted to Inanna, lady of the city, mistress of love and war. Here, builders sought new ways to glorify clay. They drove thousands of colored cones of fired clay into wet plaster, making walls glitter with patterns of red, black, and cream. They laid limestone brought from far hills, as if to say, even stone will serve this plain. Through Eanna's courts, processions moved on feast days, and in its storehouses the city kept grain, wool, and oil measured to the exact. The city was a machine not only of worship but of labor. Mass craft production first appears here with striking clarity. Potters mastered the fast wheel and cast hundreds of vessels in a single firing. The most common form was a thick-walled bowl with straight rim and flat base. Scholars call it the beveled rim bowl and debate its use. Many think it was a standard measure for rations, its volume close to a liter, though varying from 0.8 to a little more. In some, they baked a loaf of barley bread. In others, they gave out grain and beer to workers at day's end. These bowls fill the late layers of Uruk. Piled by kilns, stacked in refuse, they sound like the ceramic echo of a city that fed and paid its people by measure. Administration grew to match production. Long before letters, the plain counted with clay tokens sealed in clay envelopes, boule. In Uruk, we see the moment when counting in clay became writing in clay. At first, tablets only with numbers and signs of goods. Soon, proto-writing tablets with lists and accounts. The earliest true tablets date to the end of the 4th millennium, levels 4 and 3. On their faces are neat columns of signs for barley, beer, fish, cloth, livestock, and the professions that manage them. Signs pressed by reed cut left a straight wedge or sharp point. From this simple tool was born writing, later called cuneiform. At the same time, cylinder seals multiplied. A stone seal rolled over wet clay left a continuous scene. One showed a feast of nobles drinking beer through straws from one jar. Another, a procession of beasts for sacrifice. Each seal said, "This is mine," or "This bargain stands." Hundreds of impressions remain on doors and jars, small receipts of lost days in the noisy city. In the district of Eanna are found some of the world's first narrative images. A tall stone vessel, known as the Warka vase, shows a procession bearing gifts. Below, barley and reeds grow. Above them, animals of the herd walk. Higher still, men carry baskets and jars. At the top, a robed man offers gifts to the great lady standing before her shrine. The composition reads like theology in pictures. Nature gives harvest. People gather and prepare. The city brings gifts to the goddess, heart of the city. In the same layers was found the legendary Warka mask, a woman's face with heavy lids and strong cheeks. Once it was inlaid with stones and metals. It is one of the first realistic faces in stone known in Mesopotamia. Such things were not trinkets. They show a society with leisure for beauty, because it had learned to organize labor on a new scale. Life in Uruk rested on water, tamed by effort. In that age, the Euphrates wandered across the plain, leaving ridges and channels like ribs of a giant fish. The city bound itself to the river with canals dug deep and braced with reed bundles and bitumen. Quays led to basins where reed and wooden boats moored fast. Through this net came timber from the north, copper from the east, stone from distant lands where there was no city clay, but all its will to trade. They're a sign of far Uruk colonies, at Habuba Kabira on the Euphrates, now Syria, at Jebel Aruda nearby, and at Gordon Tepe in the Zagros. Here are found Uruk buildings, seals, and beveled rim bowls. The city spread its methods with its people, sometimes as trade posts, sometimes as colonies holding river routes and mountain passes. North and east of Sumer, in Tel Brak and the Susiana Plain, Uruk features show that ideas and officials traveled with goods. If we trust later tales and the walls uncovered by diggers, Uruk was ringed by a vast brick wall. The Epic of Gilgamesh praises it, bids the traveler read the foundation scroll and see the base laid of fired brick in bitumen. The circuit's length named in the poem is more than 9 kilometers. Though the number may be wrong, the size matches what the ruins show. The city grew in a pattern we know. Sacred quarters high on platforms, noble houses and offices around, workshops close by canals, potter's kilns and flint shops where the wind carried smoke away from holy hearth. In poor quarters, walls were thin, floors of stamped earth, hearths simple, circles of burnt clay. In rich houses, rooms gathered around courts with brick drains and buried jars for storing oil and beer. The city taught people new habits of time and number. Priests and overseers in the Eanna and other sanctuaries kept calendars bound to the moon and to the works in irrigation. They divided the year into months with names. They counted days for the clearing of canals and for harvest. They fixed festivals when rations were increased and processions moved. The metrologies beneath the tablets of Uruk show number systems on 60 and other families of counts, fit for grain, land, and labor. These are not dry facts. They are beams that hold the roof of city life. When a worker knows that a bowl equals his portion for the day, and that the sign on clay means that portion in any quarter of the city, he lives in a world where a promise can be stored and trust can move from room to room without the speaker. Technologies grew because the city required them. Brickwork became a science. Builders preferred the convex concave brick, laid quickly and holding walls firm. Bitumen was refined to seal drains and caulk boats. Copper from Oman and Iran was turned into chisels, adzes, and fishhooks. The first traces of saw and drill appear in the cuts on wood and stone. Weavers turned temple wool into cloth in large halls where dozens of loom weights lay in rows. Brewers perfected the thick, sweet beer so often seen on seals and ration lists. Bakers used molds to standardize loaves. Herds were counted and penned with precision, reflected on tablets in numbers of rams and lambs, in lists of milk and cheese. The Uruk revolution was not only of scale, it was of kind. Villages had overseers. Uruk had a bureaucracy that could assign labor, reckon it, and pay it. Villages had shrines. Uruk had temple houses with hundreds of dependents and the means to employ them. In this age appear first hints of power apart from priestly rule. Large dwellings with reception halls and storerooms rose nearby, but not within sacred zones. Some scholars see in them the seed of a palace. Whether a king, in the full sense, dwelt there is unclear, but the very architecture hints at the birth of a court beside the temple. The city learned to bear more than one center of gravity. Uruk also created a literature of images, proclaiming the order of the world. Seals of late Uruk and Jemdet Nasser show heroes fighting lions and bulls, mythic combats that Sumerian art would later repeat with finer hand. Scenes of feasts with seated guests and musicians record the ideal of elite life that would echo for centuries. The city imagined itself by building itself. That act of imagination was a fact of stone. A society that draws order with such certainty builds its institutions to match. By the end of this time, the city had spread its ways along rivers. Habuba Kabira and Jebel Aruda soon fell silent, but their plans and storerooms of Uruk-style jars show an administrative reach beyond the homeland. In the Susiana plain around Susa, the influence of Uruk was deep and lasting. At Tel Brak in the north, the great buildings of this age speak of local centers answering the southern example and rivaling it. The plain was now a landscape of equals and competitors. Kish and Nippur became names of power. Ur rose, Lagash dared. The age of villages was ended. The age of city-states began. The achievements of Uruk are confirmed by numbers and things. Tablets with thousands of records, kilns with dumps of shattered bowls, foundations of bricks with stamped marks, stone, metal, and shells brought from mountains and coasts no farmer of Eridu would ever reach. Uruk also had a voice preserved in song. Later poets put words in the mouth of Gilgamesh and made him the builder of the wall and lord of the glorious city. They praised the ramparts and bade the listener climb them and read the foundation scroll of baked brick set in bitumen. The verses give the wall an excessive length, yet the ground confirms. Uruk had a great circuit with canals within its line, with gardens and fields beyond. From that circuit, the king looked on the sanctuaries of Anu and Dinana, on the quay thick with reed boats, on granaries, storehouses, and long rows of bevel-rimmed bowls, piled like a dried clay riverbed. This was the city that raised the man who would be remembered as 2 parts God and 1 part mortal. That mixed nature was not dogma, but image. The king of Uruk stood with 1 foot in the world of men, the other in the powers that held river and harvest in balance. The oldest Sumerian songs place this king in a setting plain to the hand. In the song Gilgamesh and Aga, the ruler of Kish demands that Uruk submit. The elders of the city counsel prudence. But the men of the assembly choose resistance. Gilgamesh listens, then summons the able citizens, defeats Aga of Kish, and wins freedom for Uruk. This scene is beyond price, for it shows councils, assemblies, and a king who must not only command but persuade. It mirrors a political world one can almost touch. Kish claimed primacy over the plain. Uruk denied the claim and declared its own right to decide. Beneath the future splendor of cedar forests and distant seas lies a city that knew the worth of treaty and of revolt. Around these human bones grew a larger body of myth. In Sumerian songs preserved in later lists appears a companion named Enkidu, a wild man shaped by the goddess of birth to balance Gilgamesh's strength. A temple woman named Shamhat leads Enkidu into human life with bread, beer, and patient teaching. The two men wrestle, find measure in each other, and swear a friendship that becomes the backbone of tales. Together they go to the Cedar Land in the west, a land Mesopotamian scribes knew for its fragrance of wood and its steep ridges. There they meet a guardian named Huwawa, whom later Akkadian texts call Humbaba, a being of mountain and storm. In the art of the age, we see heroes fighting lions and bulls. In the songs, the two friends defeat the guardian of the forest, fell cedars, and bring them to a land that lacked them. Memory keeps the fact beneath the tale. The southern cities needed cedar for roofs, doors, and ritual boats. Expedition and treaty carried timber down the river valleys. The march to the forest was both mythic trial and supply route, told in grand style.
Another great tale of their bravery brought the wrath of a goddess. When the king of Uruk returned with victory, Inanna, Ishtar to the Akkadians, desired him. He refused, recalling the fates of her former lovers, men and even beasts, who met ruin when the goddess wearied of them. The refusal was bold in a city where her shrine was home. Inanna rose to heaven and begged for the bull of heaven as punishment. The bull descended, split the earth, and slew people in the streets. Gilgamesh and Enkidu faced it and killed it. They left the thigh as trophy and insulted the goddess in her rage. The gods decreed that one of the friends must pay. Enkidu sickened and died after long dreams of the underworld. The poem lingers on the king's grief. He touches the face that speaks no more. He refuses burial until a worm falls from the nose. That plain detail robs breath. In a world that filled tombs with lies, gold, and sacrifice, death remained a fact that stared back. The death of the friend forced a change. Gilgamesh looked on the wall of Uruk and saw in it a rampart that would not hold time. He set out to seek the man who had done the impossible. In the Akkadian version, this ancient survivor was called Utnapishtim. He dwelt at the mouth of the rivers, in the land later named Dilmun, near the gulf where the waters are sweet. To reach it, the king passed mountain gates guarded by scorpion men, went 12 double hours in darkness, walked through a garden where stone trees bore fruit, and met the ferryman Ur-Shanabi, who helped him cross the waters of death. The elder received him and told of the flood, the heart of the 11th tablet of the late recension. The gods wearied of human noise and sent the deluge. Ea, also called Enki, whispered the secret to a reed wall, and so saved the wise man and his house. When the waters receded, the ark came to rest on land. The saved one released birds, offered sacrifice, and was granted life without end. The tale shares lines with the older Atrahasis and a bend with the story of Noah. The link is no opinion, but the trace of cuneiform signs across tablets and centuries. When Gilgamesh begged for the same gift, he was given a test he failed. He could not hold off sleep 7 days. He was shown a plant that makes the old young. He dived to the bottom and cut it. On the way home, a serpent scented the plant, took it, and shed its skin anew, while the king sat and wept. He returned to Uruk without talisman and without friend, but with knowledge. He showed the ferryman the wall. He pointed to the foundation. He told him to read the brick. The end is not despair, but acceptance. The life of man is bounded, yet the city of brick and custom may keep a name longer than flesh, a strength. The songs themselves carry the tale of their birth. The first written glimpses of Gilgamesh appear in Sumerian lays, of Huwawa, of the bull,
of the search for drum and ball lost in the underworld. In that last, Enkidu descends and breaks the rules of the dead. He sits, he eats, he embraces, and each act robs him. At last he returns and tells what fate awaits below for men of different lots. A catalogue that sounds like a walk through fear and through comfort. In the Old Babylonian Age, about the 18th century BC, a longer Akkadian version took shape. The standard Babylonian form, known from the Library of Nineveh, holds 12 tablets, perhaps ordered by a scribe named Sin-Lekionini. The 12th is a later insert, weaving a Sumerian underworld tale into the Akkadian cycle. The tablets of Nineveh lay buried until the 19th century of our era. Archaeologists carried them to the Museum of London. In 1872, a young assistant, George Smith, read the lines of the flood from the 11th tablet before a hall struck with wonder. The press shouted of the find, and the ancient king of Uruk again walked the streets of a new time. The epic is no mere fancy. It holds memory of Uruk as a place of law and craft. It recalls cedar from the west, copper from the east, and lapis from lands beyond the rivers. It names places, binding myth to map. Marshu, the mountain gate. Dilmun, the shore at the rising. It knows the tools of the city life. Beer is drunk through long straws from a common jar. Seals are rolled on wet clay so contracts stand true. Priests and dream readers stand beside the king. The gods are many, yet they act as witnesses of the law that binds society. When Gilgamesh offends the goddess, it is not mere pride punished. He breaks a pillar of the city, its honor, and its right. Archaeology adds to the tale. In the precinct of Inanna was found the Warka vase and a marble face once inlaid, showing the city of legend's birth. Dumps of bevel-rim bowls speak of rations for the workers. The tablets of late Uruk and Jemdet Nasar already record wool, barley, and beer given out. Cedar beams and doors that held the great halls of Uruk demanded mountains to the west. Even the platform of the White Temple bears bricks with stamps, laid in rows, the habit of count and mark in open view, which heirs would take as normal. The legend does not invent the wall. It makes it proof that the city and its builders could leave a trace that time itself must heed. There is more in the image of Gilgamesh. In the wide lore of Sumer and Akkad, he is not only a hunter of monsters, but a judge of wisdom. In the late dialogue Theodicy, the speaker lists the wrongs of the world and asks why the gods allow them. In other wise texts, the name of Gilgamesh stands as authority, a voice worth hearing. The builder and warrior becomes for later scribes a keeper of sayings. This change reflects the fate of Sumerian culture itself. After the fall of cities, it lived on in the tongue of learning and right in Babylonian schools. And what do we see walking with this king along the eastern wall at sunset? We see that a city is both brick and tale. We see that the search for endless life turns into care for the name carried by others. We see that the world's first great literature rose from a place where ration counts, cylinder seals, and water levels filled the days. The songs remember the man, but honor the society that taught him to measure, to plan, and to leave his work in open form. So the last lines of the standard version lead the listener back to Uruk and bid him look on the wall. When villages learned to count in thousands and temples to feed the city, pride and fear walked the same streets. The plain between Tigris and Euphrates became a board of sacred capitals, each city a house of its god, with fields, canals, workshops, and a wall that promised safety. Kish claimed the elder voice and called its ruler King of Kish, a title meaning more than one city, yet less than the world. Uruk kept the memory of first greatness. Ur guarded the wealth of the moon god. Lagash worked and watched its borders. Umma gazed across the canal at land it called its own. Each city could summon men for canals and call warriors to arms. Each held scribes for rations and priests for the calendar. Where water is life, there the border is not a line in sand. It is the gap between full granaries and hunger. So began the first long wars, not for gold nor idea, but for rights of irrigation and the right to speak first in Nippur. Nippur stood in the heart of Sumer without its own crown. It was the house of Enlil, lord of wind and command, the place where kingship was confirmed. A ruler seeking seniority had to do more than win battles. He came to the Akor temple in Nippur and took the blessing of Enlil. That grace was political truth in sacred dress. It held fragile order among proud neighbors. The title King of Kish moved from city to city, but blessing in Nippur gave a mask the gods could affirm. The first famous feud of the southern plain set Lagash against Umma for the fertile land of Guiden, edge of the lowland. The claim was old already when the first texts were written. A king of Kish named Masilim, ruling about mid-3rd millennium BC, judged the quarrel, set a border, and fixed it with a stele, calling gods as witnesses. Time broke the peace. An Ensi of Umma named Ush tore down the marks and drove into fields that Lagash held as gift of Ningirsu, its warrior god. Eonatum of Lagash called his people and marched, leaving behind a carved limestone that we call the Stele of the Vultures. The warriors of Lagash stride in close array, with long spears and tall square shields. The god Ningirsu looms taller than men, casting the foes of the city into nets. Vultures pick at bodies on the ground. The message is plain and without verse. The border was broken, Lagash punished. The stele is both record and threat. Eonatum did not halt with one victory. About 2450 to 2425 BC, he forced Umma to swear to keep the border, to pay grain, and to admit the right of Ningirsu to the land in strife. He also fought farther. In lists and broken notes, he appears as a rare lord who subdued several cities at once. He boasted of triumphs in in Uruk, and even over Elamite towns to the east. His rule was not empire in later sense, but a net of oaths held as long as the sword was near. Yet it was wider than the parish wars of before. After him came his kin, Enmetena, who renewed the pact with Umma in exact words. His building cones keep measures of fields, water duties, and curses for breakers. The tongue is dry and so strong. A plot named, a canal named, a fine in grain set. These lines tell how Sumer fought and how Sumer strove to stop war. The warriors of that world were citizens, called from fields and workshops when temple and palace summoned. The word for warrior, Eren. Commanders used reed lists to count men and assign rations. On the famed war panel of the Standard from royal tombs about 2600 BC, infantry march in ranks. Captives are led to a seated lord. Heavy carts thunder behind mules. These are not horses. The true horse came later from far steppes. The wagons are four-wheeled, with solid wheels, bearing a driver and a spearman. They break ranks and chase fugitives. The foot soldiers bear long spears, axes, and maces. Copper helmets guard the head. Cloaks of felt or hide cover the body. The steel of the vultures shows a wall of shields marching in order. We see first formations that may be named without guess. Politics was a system of titles, as of spears. Ensi, city ruler, often clan prince and priest in the god's house. Lugal, great man, king in full sense, who claimed power beyond the city. Gilgamesh was called Lugal of Uruk. Eonatum called himself both Ensi of Lagash and king of the lands he subdued. When Levi drew men from fields, granaries raised rations for their homes. When festivals filled the courts, beer rations grew with them. A city at war must keep accounts if it would live through winter. Tablets that reached us from Lagash and Umma of those struggles list not only fines for border breach, but tallies of fish, of sheep and goats, and pay for boatmen who ferried barley along canals, the very canals the wars were fought to guard. Religion stood not aside from these deeds. Each city fought under the eye of its patron god. Lagash marched for Ningirsu. Umma swore by Shara. Ur prayed to Nana for safe roads and full barns. When borders were set, both sides called their gods to witness. When a pact was carved, curses were written for any ruler who dared to move the stone, and excuses for the clerk forced to obey his lord's order. Processions in Nippur showed unity even when unity had to be held in the same hand as the spear. In this age, law, cult, and politics were braided as one cord. By its end, the map of Sumer was a field of rivals, knowing each other and copying each other. A habit began to keep laws in writing. A habit began to bring disputes to third judgment. A habit began to wield titles to gather many towns under one hand. A habit began to rule troops and stores with seals and tablets. From such habits would rise a new ruler who cared not who bore the title King of Kish, so long as all cities paid the same tax. He would come from the north and teach Sumer the meaning of the word empire. The daily labor began in the fields. Barley was a reliable grain, enduring salt better than wheat. Date palms lined the dikes, their roots reaching deep, their crowns casting shade over crops. Teams of oxen pulled heavy plows through wet soil. Cedar plows that dropped seed directly into the furrow appear in early carvings, speeding the sowing and keeping it straight. Farmers set irrigation by the moon and by rules handed down from fathers and uncles. Too much water left the soil white with salt. Too little dried young barley. Gates were opened and closed on the appointed days, and main canals were cleaned in the set month before the river's flood. Fish from canals and backwaters filled pots, together with onions, garlic, beans, and bread of coarse barley flour. Beer, so thick it was sipped with a straw, was both ration and comfort. Oil from sesame or clarified fat gave taste to the stew. Thus was born the first cuisine of cities, honest and nourishing. The temple oversaw the economy from key to threshing floor. Plots were granted to dependents under terms fixed in clay. Herds grazed on temple pastures under the eyes of inspectors. Weaving rooms in sacred courts and city quarters turned wool into cloth by lots. Wool issued out, finished cloth returned, recorded on a tablet. Brewers and bakers received grain by measure and gave back beer and bread in the agreed amount. The city paid many workers in rations, not in coin, for coins did not yet exist. Tablets from granaries list barley, oil, and beer allotted by measures of strength and greater measures. A small cup with a clipped rim found in Uruk's heaps of shards may have served as a standard portion. A humble clay vessel carried in its form the arithmetic of a city. At the center of this order stood the scribes. A boy entering the tablet house
first learned to mold clay of proper temper, then to hold a cut reed and press wedges at the right angle. He copied lists until they entered both his hand and his dreams. Lists of numbers and measures, of trades and ranks, of birds, trees, and stones. Then came sample contracts and receipts. Later, mathematics, where measures of volume, length, and land had their signs. The Sumerians loved the base 60 system, foundation of our 60 minutes and 360 degrees. Capacity was reckoned from the sila, about a liter. Greater amounts were counted in gur, several hundred sila, varying with the age. Land was measured in iku, a square, later set at 100 cubits by 100 cubits. A city that could measure fields and count rations could demand labor fairly and pay fairly. Once a city learned to set these measures in clay, memory became longer than any life. Law grew first as custom, held by elders and priests, then as rulings written so an official could no longer secretly bend the weight of justice. Already in the early dynastic age appear contracts ruling on marriage, sale, adoption, and debt. A typical marriage tablet names the parties, the bride gift, the dowry, and witnesses, then calls the city god to punish whoever breaks the terms. Adoption could give an heir to a house without sons. The adoptee must care for aged parents and receive a fixed share of land and property. Debt contracts fixed sum, term, and pledge. Witnesses were listed, seals rolled across wet clay, binding the terms. In disputes, men swore by the name of the city's god. In grave cases, later records show the river ordeal. The accused waded in that the god might judge. Who swore and lived went free. Who swore lightly and drowned proved the accuser's right.
The written word went beyond accounts and reached reforms. In Lagash, the ruler Urukagina set down a list of injustices he forbade. He swore priests and officials would no longer seize boats or oxen without payment. He decreed that burial fees would be limited, that the poor would not be driven to sell themselves or their children for trifles. He tried to break the habit of petty theft cloaked as tax. Only fragments survive, yet they show a program to shield the common folk from 1,000 small cuts. Not yet a code in articles, as later, a proclamation to be quoted back at the ruler. Thus, law was born in a city where too often the governor became the thief. Courts sat at temple gates or in offices beside sacred courts. Benches of judges sat with the city scribe who set down terms and verdict. Decisions were sometimes copied on foundation cones or memorial tablets and buried in walls, that every later official should read them passing the threshold. When cities quarreled, they brought boundary stones and old tablets into a third place for judgment. Masilim of Kish once drew the border between Lagash and Umma and raised a stela. Later, Enmetena forced his neighbor to swear on the same line and wrote down the oath. The habit of recording decisions bound peace firmer than memory. Titles and offices shaped society. The city god had a high priest and a high priestess. In later ages, the priestess of Ur was regal and famed. At all times, many cult officials performed rites that fed the god and kept the flame. The Ensi ruled the city under the gaze of the deity, while the Lugal claimed rule if he held more than one city. Beneath stood overseers managing fields, herds, and workshops. The word inspector carried true power, for whoever held the lists decided who would eat and who go hungry. Free citizens owed service. Dependents labored on temple lands. Slaves existed and are named in tablets. Yet in Sumer, the line between a poor free man and a debt-bound dependent was thin, often set by debt. The market gave place to merchants who moved goods for gain. The Sumerian word damgar named the trader who could carry wool to a far city and return with metals and stone, settling accounts before the same scribes who tallied temple rations. Religion kept the calendar that bound all together. Each city kept a list of months where canal work and harvest matched the gods' festivals. On feast days, rations rose, musicians played in the courts. Processions went from the temple of the city's god to allied shrines. Offerings were burned or poured by formulas memorized on many lips and later written for students, so tradition would last when old chanters grew weary. Gods in these rites were no ornaments. They were faces of civic duty. To cheat the measure was to cheat the god. To shift a boundary stone was to insult the god who guarded that field. The last turn of this chapter lies at the threshold of true codes of law. The habit of contracts, of written rulings, of public decrees came into full bloom in the next age. The Code of Ur-Nammu of Ur's third dynasty opens with a prologue. The king set justice when An and Enlil granted him kingship. It sets penalties for wounds and thefts, and assigns compensations in silver and barley. It is the oldest law code we have, laid out in ordered lines. Later kings of the land would add their own, but the Sumerians had made the chief step. They took the ruler's voice and the god's will and fixed them in clay, so a poor man could point to a line and say, "Here is my right." From field and canal to seal and tablet, Sumer learned to make justice a practice. They did not end corruption. They did not end wars. They did the harder thing. They gave common people tools for joint labor on a scale never seen. And they taught rulers that a promise written in clay holds more weight than a boastful oath. These lessons faced a conqueror from the north, one who prized records more than many kings prized spears. The land had already learned the language of rivalry. Then came the man who taught it a new grammar of power. His Akkadian name, Sharukin, the king is legitimate. We call him Sargon. Later storytellers claimed he was set adrift in a basket, raised by a gardener, then came to the court of Kish. A legend, yet fitting. He first appears as cupbearer to Ur-Zababa of Kish, trusted officer with access to the king and levers of the palace. From that narrow role he strode into history, reaching from Zagros to the Levantine coast and from the Gulf marshes to Anatolia's foothills. Lugal-Zaggisi of Umma had crushed Lagash and claimed the title King of Sumer, boasting he ruled from the lower to the upper sea. Sargon made that boast true, but for another name. Rising from Kish, he defeated Uruk in the field, seized Lugal-Zaggisi, and led him in chains to Nippur. The text says he brought his rival to the gate and made him bow in Enlil's shrine. A precise act. The victor won not just a battle, but the seal of legitimacy where kingship was decreed. From there he moved fast and did not stop. He struck Kish if Kish resisted, took Umma and Lagash in turn, and forced the southern cities to accept his officials and his calendar of decrees. He founded a new capital, Agade, later called Akkad. Its exact site is lost, likely on the Tigris north of Kish and near the road to Sippar. The city gave its name to a people and an age. Sargon raised there a great temple of Ishtar of Agade, honoring the goddess under her Semitic name, but never forgetting she was the same Inanna who ruled Uruk. He reigned as king of Sumer and Akkad, as lord of the four quarters, a title claiming rule to the compass's ends. His own inscriptions are terse and proud. He says 5,400 men dined before him daily. More than boast, it points to a standing army, fed from royal stores, a new tool in a land where armies had been mustered by season. His conquests spread in rings. First, the Sumerian south, city after city, taking Akkadian garrisons and governors while keeping their temples and rites. Then the east. Sargon fought Elam and its cities on the Susian plain, crossed the lower Zagros, and drew the mountain routes into his net. To the west, he followed the Euphrates past Mari and Tutal, reaching the Cedar Land. Later sources credit him with victories at Ebla and even ships on the Western Sea. Even if we set aside scribe zeal, the shape is clear. By his career's end, Akkadian power touched or influenced all routes by which metals, wood, and stone had flowed to Sumer for ages. He won not by spears alone. He knew such a wide realm needed bonds that no drought could break. He wove religion into rule. At he set his daughter Enheduanna as high priestess of Nana, the moon god. The post tied the city's sacred estate to the new royal house and gave the world its first named author. Enheduanna composed hymns of lasting beauty, among them Exaltation of Inanna, where she speaks with the voice of priestess and princess. Her words show how Akkadian rule dressed itself in Sumerian song, not erasure. Sargon also honored Nippur as Enlil's seat, keeping its favor to hold Sumer. To take Uruk was shrewd, to keep Nippur pleased was wiser. Administration grew to new scale. The Akkadian king kept Sumerian office titles, but filled them with his men. City governors, still called Enzi in many texts, reported to royal commissioners and to a palace now set above all temples. Akkadian became the language of letters between far officials, written in the Cuneiform perfected by Sumerian scribes. Weights and measures were set in order. Seals show the new title, King of the Four Quarters, often with the king grappling lion or bull. The image stamped every jar and every gate. Roads and rivers were marked by stages with royal posts where messengers changed animals and loads were tallied. The map began to think like a state. Trade widened under one rule. Copper from Magan, now Oman, fed Akkadian smiths. Stone for vessels and seals came from Iran's hills. Lapis still arrived from lands beyond Elam by old routes. Texts name Dilmun as partner and way station in the Gulf and speak of Meluha. Many scholars link it with the Indus. Akkadian seals and weights appear far from Sumer. In return, the south sent woolen cloth, oil, and grain. When a shipmaster or caravaner bore a tablet sealed with Agade's mark, he carried more than goods. He carried a pass that opened stores and stilled city gates. Sargon fought many times to hold what he had won. Later chronicles say that in old age all the lands rose against him, and he tore down their walls and carried off their soil. Perhaps this compresses many campaigns into one image, yet it matches the stubbornness of cities that had known their own will for centuries. He built and rebuilt his realm by force and appointments. In early inscriptions he does not name his sons, but later tradition calls them Remush and Manishtushu, men who fought again in the same places, binding the crown tighter. The machine he created demanded fuel and attention. It rewarded him, and it wore him down. The art of war changed under his hand because need forced it. A permanent corps of troops was fed from the royal storehouses, which means steady pay and a stable supply line. The militias of the cities still formed a large part of the army, but the king's standing force held the center and taught the rest the rhythm. Bows, spears, and axes remained the tools of battle, but supply itself became a weapon. The season of campaign still tied to harvest and flood, as always, but with a net of garrisons and depots, the king could march earlier and endure longer. Fortified posts along rivers and roads held the new scale in place. When he took a city, he spared temples if they bent and replaced elders if they did not. He learned what parts of the system must not be broken if the breaker wished the system to serve him. There is another measure of his success. He turned the title King of Sumer and Akkad into a fixed formula. Before him, the South and the Akkadian North were worlds that met through markets and shrines. Under him, they became one kingdom, a realm to name in a single breath. Echoes lasted. Later kings, even from lines not born of his blood, claimed his legacy by using his titles and honoring his capital. They praised Akkad in hymns and explained its later fall as the anger of the gods, another way of saying the city once stood at the center of their world. Sargon belongs to dates and to tales. He likely began to rule around 2334 BCE and reigned more than 50 years. Later lists dispute the exact years, yet the sequence is clear. He rose after Lugo-Zaggisi. He set the capital in Akkad. He bound south and north. He marched east and west. He crushed revolts and stood victorious. He left the throne first to one son, then to another. His grandson would be Naram-Suen, who would lift the crown to its highest peak and lead it to its fall. Akkad taught Sumer a new measure of politics. The city-state remained the base unit. The temple still fed and counted. The scribal school still taught on wet clay. But above the familiar life now stood the palace, thinking in provinces and month-long marches. The plain met empire. It would never forget that meeting. Sargon left a realm that needed both hands to hold it. His sons tried to keep the grip. Ramush ruled first. Early in his reign, nearly all the great cities of the south rose against him. His inscriptions name Ur, Umma, Adab, and Lagash among the rebels. He marched and broke them one by one. He crossed east to Susiana and defeated Abel-Gamash of Warashe and other mountain lords. He brought back copper and silver, carried away statues and door leaves, showing that Elam would not plunder the plain without cost. Ramush speaks in harsh lines on stone. He set fines in silver. He proclaimed the number of captives. He tells us that the empire still had strength when the southern cities tested its yoke. His reign ended suddenly. A late record says courtiers killed him. In a realm sown by loyalty and fear, a knife in a dark room could undo what years of campaigns had secured. After him came Manishtushu. He met new unrest in the north and east, then turned his gaze to the sea. A royal inscription tells of a march that reached Magan, land many place in Oman, after battles with 32 cities. The text reads like an account by a man who understood the thirsts of copper mines and the hunger of Akkadian workshops for metal. His reign left a tall stone monument, the so-called obelisk of Manishtushu, carved with records of land sales and temple gifts. It names fields, canals, and neighbors in exact lines. It shows an imperial administration that could record holdings and leases beyond city walls across provinces. And he too fell by a murderer's hand. The crown passed to Sargon's grandson, whose name would outshine all Akkadian kings. Naram-Suen took the throne and set it aflame. In the 9th year of his reign, if later year names are read true, all the lands of the realm rebelled. The phrase is a formula, yet also truth. He marched from edge to edge, broke cities, planted garrisons, then altered the fabric of empire. He took the title King of the 4 quarters of the world, and went further. In his lifetime, he allowed scribes to set the divine sign before his name. He wore the horned crown, mark of gods in Mesopotamian art. On the famous stele showing his triumph over the Lulubi mountain folk, he climbs the rocky slope with warriors behind, while foes writhe at his feet. Stars look down, as if to seal his choice. The stele is not just boast. It is a declaration that empire would speak with a voice claiming more than mortal rank. His campaigns were wide. He struck the Lulubi and other Zagros tribes and cut his victories into living rock. He recorded conquests in Armanum and Ebla to the west, where cedars grow and rivers run to the sea. He pushed south along the Gulf, and late sources tell of tribute from Dilmun and Magan. Under his hand, the royal road system grew formal. Messengers moved between fixed stations. Provinces joining many cities were placed under governors. These governors bore titles blending Sumerian roots with Akkadian recast. Grain levies and silver dues were recorded and carried to Agade. The language of letters across the realm was Akkadian in cuneiform. Scribes still copied Sumerian hymns and laws in temple schools, but merchants, generals, and officials exchanged words in the Semitic tongue of the court. Trade widened because empire secured the roads and because the palace had new needs. Copper from Magan fed the smiths making tools and weapons for garrisons from Susa to Mari. Hard stones from Iran became cylinder seals and vessels bearing the king's mark across the land. Lapis came from far beyond Elam. In return, the south sent cloth from temple wool, oil in standard jars, and grain gathered in tax and issued in rations. When goods bore tablets sealed by the king, guards stood aside and storehouse doors opened. Such a realm needed uniform weights and measures. Akkadian officials adopted and spread standard minas and shekels of silver and standard grain jars. This was the dry backbone of power. Without it, even the strongest army cannot eat in winter. The story of Naram-Suen carries a dark line. The later poem, Curse of Akkad, says he offended Enlil in Nippur, attacked the holy city, and tore down its sacred walls. In the tale, the gods sent the Gutians from the mountains to destroy Akkad. The plot is both theology and memory. Theology, because fall follows pride. Memory, because the Gutians truly swarmed from Zagros in the generations after Naram-Suen and broke the fabric Sargon had woven.
The fall came through many hands. After Naram-Suen came Shar-Kali-Shari. His name means King of all kings, yet his reign reads like a long siege. Letters from the north complain of raids. Southern records speak of short rains and broken supplies. The Gutians cut roads and ruined canals. City lords who had sworn to Agade raised their banners again. Drought pressed from the sky about 2200 BCE. Climate records from northern Mesopotamia and Syria show a shift to dryness lasting decades. At Tel Leilan in northern Sumer, a layer of wind-blown dust lay over abandoned streets. Rain-fed fields failed in the north. Refugees moved toward the rivers. The same change of weather sharpened the old curse of salt in the south, forcing farmers yet more to rely on barley and leaving some lands barren. When canals were clogged and dikes broken by war, winter waters stood, and summer heat burned salt upon the soil. The system that made cities strong turned against them if labor no longer held it in order. Shar-Kali-Shari died, and a handful of names followed in quick steps. Dudu and Shu-Turul are remembered, yet their power hardly reached beyond the capital. Within decades, the Akkadian kingdom became a title without an army to enforce. Even Agade itself slipped from memory. Later kings praised and cursed it in poems, but the place of its walls has never been found. This is a hard line. The capital that ruled the two rivers for a century and a half vanished so utterly that modern study cannot fix its stones. The end was not one battle. It was a draining loss on all sides. Roads broken by raids, granaries emptied by failed harvests. Governors keeping taxes for themselves, for no royal army stood close enough to punish.
Sumer did not fall at once with Akkad. The Gutians did not build a true state. They raided and ruled a while from the highlands, but they did not restore canals nor weigh grain justly. Their presence made life so hard that the Sumerian cities sought a leader. The answer came from Uruk, then from Ur. In the next generation, Utuhego of Uruk rose in the south, drove back the mountain tribes, and cleared the ground for a Sumerian house to claim the land again. Ur-Nammu of Ur seized this chance and gave the plain new order. The age of Sargon ended, but it left a lesson the south would use again. A kingdom can be larger than a city, and a net can be stronger than any wall, if the net is kept. The Akkadian arc left a deep mark even in its fall. It made Akkadian the common speech of power from the Gulf to the upper river for many centuries. It set the style of titles and claims. Later kings, never having seen Akkad, still called themselves King of Sumer and Akkad, Lord of the Four Quarters, borrowing Sargon's light. It taught temple estates and palaces to work together on a scale copied by later dynasties. It left art that still speaks in stone. The horned crown on Naram-Suen's head is the sign that Rule had learned to use the language of gods upon men. The same crown is also a warning, for later scribes said it was why the gods turned away. The time of the Gutians left the plain drained, canals silted, boundary stones toppled, granaries empty, and road guards weak. The first reply came from Uruk, where Utuhegel united the southern cities and defeated the last Gutian king, Tirigan, as the old inscriptions say. For a short while, Utuhegel held the high seat in Ur. He set his trusted man, Ur-Nammu, as governor. Soon the balance shifted again. Ur-Nammu took the crown for himself and set a standard phrase at the head of his titles: King of Ur, King of Sumer and Akkad. This was not mere boasting, it was a statement of program. He sought to bind the south into one order and to make that order visible in brick, in clay, and in the movement of bread from granary to hand. Ur-Nammu chose his capital with care. It rose where river trade met the sea, and its god was Nana, the moon, whose cycles had long measured work and feast. The king ordered his masons to labor in the sacred quarter. The great ziggurat of Ur rose in stages of mud brick packed with filler, faced with fired brick laid in bitumen. 3 monumental stairways climbed its front to the terrace where the moon god's shrine stood. Its base measured near 2/3 of a stadium in length and almost half in width, mass that turned the horizon into architecture. Bricks stamped with his name and titles still show where his men laid rows steady, one atop another, to a height that later kings repaired and renewed. The ziggurat did more than honor a god. It declared that the south once more had a center, a place where the calendar would be kept and where rations could be weighed without fear. Law moved from custom toward codification. At this same time, fragments from Nippur and Ur kept lines from what scholars called the Code of Ur-Nammu. Its prologue declared that An and Enlil gave him kingship and that he set justice in the land. The laws fixed fines in silver for bodily harm and theft, laid out rules for divorce and the penalty for false accusation, and named death for murder and for crimes that threatened the order of households. The words were plain and left little room for tricks of a crooked judge. If a man put out another's eye, he pays the set weight of silver. If he lied about another in court, he pays the set weight. If he defiled a married woman, he dies, and the woman is cleared. If he divorced without cause, he pays her with silver and grain. This code is the oldest in such form. It did not exhaust the law, but it gave both officials and common folk a line to point to when memory and influence clashed. Court and temple worked on tablets, and schools of scribes lived again. Boys learned Sumerian lists, copied sample contracts, and solved problems teaching how to count capacity, land, and labor in the base 60 system. The market tongue was more and more Akkadian, but the speech of law and hymn stayed Sumerian. Royal hymns of the time praised the king as builder and maker of justice. Archives from Umma and Drahim show the machine behind the praise. They list crews of women at looms and the wool issued to them, boatmen and the barley rations that kept their strength, daily brick quotas for wall work and the beer allotted after sunset. Poetry and numbers described one world from different ends. Ur-Nammu relied on a net of governors to keep provinces in order. The old title Ensi still appears, but its holders now answered to the court at Ur, where scribes could read their reports, and the will was ready to send inspectors if numbers did not match. In Nippur, the priesthood was honored and preserved. No king who wished to hold the south could insult the house of Enlil. He set his kin into sacred offices. The house of the moon god and the royal house were bound by right and account. The king's seal and the god's seal kept the storehouses honest. The army relearned its craft while canals and walls rose again. The Gutians still raided through Zagros passes. Amorite groups pressed along the middle Euphrates and slipped into the riverlands as clients and mercenaries. Year names of Ur-Nammu speak of enemies subdued and victories set up. Garrisons on the borders and patrols along the main canals made travel safe enough for trade to grow. When the state could promise that a boat would not be robbed between quays, that a caravan would find water at the named station, merchants once more risked the far roads. Copper from the Gulf, stone from Elam, and timber from the upper streams again flowed to Ur's docks. In exchange, the south sent cloth, oil, and grain that the palace drew without begging the city council. His reign began about 2112 BC, by the middle count, and lasted near 2 decades. Dates shift by some years, but the order is clear. He followed Utu-Hegal. He rebuilt. He made law. He entered the south, and his end was sudden. A later tale says he fell in battle in the north. Be it so, he left a machine in motion and an heir who knew how to use it. Later ages remembered Ur-Nammu as builder with a basket on his head. On foundation plaques, he is shown bearing clay for the god's house, a ping serving by raising brick. The image was not only piety, but truth. He restored the visible frame of the south, walls and temples, and he restored the hidden frame, measures, calendars, and laws that let strangers work together without fear. A step, once wagged under Gutians, became a single cloth again. Ur-Nammu left a city that had found breath once more. His son took that breath and turned it into a long, steady run. Shulgi sat on the throne near 48 years, from 2094 to 2047 BC, in the count of most scholars. Length gave him the chance to finish what his father began and to widen it, until the south moved in one rhythm the court at Ur could name and measure. Bricks tell the first part of his reign. He completed and perfected the great ziggurat of Nana. Its fired brick facing was renewed and secured, its corners made clean. Stairs rose with perfect slope, and at the top stood the shrine of the moon god and his consort Ningal. Inscriptions on bricks and copper pins name Shulgi as builder in Ur, in Uruk at Inanna's Eanna, in Nippur at Enlil's Ekur, in Eridu at the House of the Deep, and in many smaller cities whose shrines had sunk in years of ruin. Year names of his reign sound like a catalogue of works. Year a wall was raised. Year a temple of Inanna in Uruk was built. Year a great granary was set in Nippur. The king set pride in works that made rule possible and shrines that made rule visible. He joined stone and song. The court fostered a stream of learned writings in Sumerian that students still call the hymns of Shulgi.
In them, the king speaks as ruler and as man who could read and write, who knew tablets, played the lyre, judged cases, reckoned math, kept the calendar, and ran with youthful strength, even in age. One hymn boasts that he ran from Nippur to in a day, testing the royal road and its stations. Whether the distance was literal or poetic is less weighty than the fact. The administration behind the boast was real. Inns stood at even intervals. Couriers bore clay letters from station to station. Inspectors checked roads, bridges, and water for caravans and troops. The phrase royal road in this age meant a route written on clay and sealed by officials whose marks were honored at every gate. The machine that moved goods and tribute through the south became very regular under Shulgi. The rotation system begun by his father ripened into a calendar of deliveries that scribes could audit. Provinces in turn each month sent herds, grain, oil, hides, and woven cloth. The great intake at Puzurish Dagan near Nippur fixed the flow of stock and goods with accuracy museums still feel on their shelves. Tens of thousands of tablets survive from there. One may list scores of animals with marks of sex and age, herdsmen, recipients, and officers sealing the deal. Others record wool issued to weavers and cloth returned by number and grade. Umma sent one sort in one month, Lagash another in the next. Officials matched outgoing and incoming and set all down in writing taught in every school from the coast to the middle river.
The measures grew stricter again. The sila remained the basic unit for grain and beer, grouped in tens for larger sums and in sixes for a gur. Barley rations for workers were fixed by these measures, appearing on tablets as neat rows of numbers that any scribe from any city could read. Silver was weighed in shekels and minas on balances checked against temple treasuries. Land was marked in squares, lengths stretched by rope, written down by canal frontage and days of water allotment. Shulgi's bureaucracy turned these counts into dated duties. A plot owed men for canal cleaning in the first month, a shepherd lambs in spring. A brewer received barley on the second day of the third month and returned beer on the fifth. Justice here was not only the matter of courts, it was whether the overseer honored the schedule written on the tablet. Law had not slept after Namu's code. Shulgi issued edicts setting levies, curbing abuses, and confirming rights that officials sometimes bent. Posting royal decrees at temple gates and copying them for the provinces became the norm. Contracts show courts in action for adoptions, marriages, loans, sales, and land disputes. Witness lists grew long and careful. Seals rolled out new titles that Shulgi took in midlife. Around halfway through his reign, he allowed the divine sign to be written before his name. Texts called him the god Shulgi, king of Ur, king of the four quarters. He set his statues in temples to receive offerings and to stand as visible pledges of royal care for rights. Deification in life was no whim. It framed palace and temple as one. Shulgi knew one cult could not hold borders. He fought often, especially eastward, where the Zagros hid restless neighbors. Year names mark victories over Sumurum and the Lulubians, the capture of their rulers. Rock reliefs in passes show the king pressing his foot on a captive, his name cut beside the names of beaten tribes. Garrisons held valleys and towns of the Diyala to guard the road into the mountains. Forts bearing his name rose at western crossings. Shulgi struck along the upper Euphrates as well, but deeper there loomed the slow shadow of the Amorites, then called Martu, nomads and herdsmen who could be clients and soldiers, or raiders. Shulgi hired some, struck others, seeking to keep banks and roads safe without raising walls that would choke trade. That step his heirs would take,
building the long wall across the middle Euphrates to shut out the west. Diplomacy was as busy as war. Gifts and letters moved between Ur and Susa, Ur and Anshan, Ur and northern cities. Elamite princes appear as allies and sons-in-law on tablets and seals. The court gave royal daughters to strong houses and claimed kinship when neighbors grew bold. Tribute lists from the east show copper, timber, and stone, and also hostages, their names and upkeep recorded at palace gates. The south was no longer a field of equals. It became a realm with one court, knowing the names of distant chiefs and the sums they owed. The schools of scribes reached new polish. Exercise tablets preserved the steps of training. The boy copied signs, then lists, then model contracts, then proverbs and hymns. Some tablets show the teacher's neat column beside the pupil's wavering line, a picture as human as history itself. The program fixed Sumerian as the language of learning, while Akkadian became the speech of daily life. Bilingual lists taught officials to pass between them. So grew the class of scribes who could serve in Ur or in Mari without stumbling over words. The Golden Age economy wore a public and a private face. The palace and temples directed the largest streams of grain, cloth, and cattle. Yet private merchants thrived inside this frame. Tablets named traders who took wool and silver on account from the palace, went north or east, and returned with metals and stone. Profit and tax were written by the same hand. Market squares gained steady awnings and stalls. Standard jars and weights at benches made deals possible between strangers. The palace did not invent the market. It gave it rules.
The pride of the age is heard in how Shulgi was later remembered. He was praised as a just judge, as a runner whose legs knew no weariness, as a scribe who knew the signs, as a warrior who crushed highlanders, as a lover of music and keeper of festivals whose calendar held the South together. Beneath the praise lies the sense that the system lived by motion. Roads had to be patrolled, canals dredged, storehouse guards had to keep honesty, governors had to stay alert. The same texts that hail victories over Simurum and the Lalubians also speak of floods that broke dikes and of grain shortages demanding sudden relief. A long rain bought time, but no rain buys peace beyond its years. Shulgi left a kingdom that worked. After him came Amarsin, then Shusin, then Ibisin. Each still kept the rotation of tribute and the schools. Each faced Amorite pressure and eastern raids with armies and with building works. Shusin raised a vast defensive line in the west, later texts calling it the wall that keeps the Tidnum out. That wall itself tells the tale. It was the deed of a power still able to command labor, but it was also the deed of a power that felt the ground tremble beneath it. When harvests grew thin and caravans needed escorts farther and farther, a wall was not only a plan, but a hope. The last ruler of the house, Ibisin, learned how fast hope falls when kings weigh silver from empty jars. For a moment, across 2 generations, the South reached a balance of piety, number, and power that turned a field of rivals into a true common realm. The ziggurat at Ur still rises to prove it. The tablets in museums still whisper its daily arithmetic. The hymns of Shulgi still sing his confidence. But the shadow at the edge of the feast was already there. New peoples moved, old fields tired. Rulers without Shulgi's patience inherited his machine and watched the belt slip one by one. His long reign ended in a state that lived by one calendar and kept books with one hand. His heirs could not hold the threads from fraying. After him, the throne held Amarsin, then Shusin, then Ibisin. For a while, the rotation of tribute still drove herds to Puzreshtagan near Nippur, and year names still praised strong walls and new canals. But the tide turned.
Prices for barley and wool rose sharply, as the tablets tell. Officials wrote of scant rations and delayed deliveries. Governors who once hurried to the call began to send letters begging for more silver and more troops. The South was still rich in law and habit, but the muscle that drove the system began to tire. Pressure came from two sides. To the west, Amorite groups drifted along the middle Euphrates with flocks and wagons, sometimes as mercenaries, sometimes as raiders. To the east, the mountain lords of Elam and the dynasties of Shimashki probed the lowlands and found soft ground. Shu-Sin tried to guard the west. He raised a long defensive line, later called by scribes the wall that keeps the Tidnum out. The name belongs to an Amorite people. The barrier stretched across the northern rim of Sumer, from Tigris to Euphrates, tying river to river with forts and gates. It was a public work on the scale of a canal or city wall, a deed that showed the state still commanded labor, and at once that it feared what lay beyond. Walls delay hunger, but they do not turn it into peace. The administration cracked before the palaces did. The archives at Puzrish Dagan, once a steady stream of sheep and cattle records, thinned in Shu-Sin's late years and Ibisin's. The letters of that time carry the tone of complaint. In one, an official named Ishbi-Era, serving the house, writes that the price of grain in the Middle Land has gone mad, and he cannot buy enough to feed the army without more silver from the court. He begs the king to let him take control of Isin and Nippur to guard the country's heart. The plea shows both need and ambition. When a general demands cities as payment, the center is already slipping. Ibisin inherited a throne that met disaster daily. His year names still mark victorious campaigns, but also betray courtly fear. To name a year for wall or canal repair means the arteries were in danger. The Amorite drift had become steady pressure. Caravans needed guards. Farmers of the Middle Land shifted closer to strongholds or gave service to lords who could protect them. To the east, the Elamite kings of Shimashki acted first as allies, then as predators. Their troops came down from passes faster than levies gathered, and their leaders struck storehouses and seal-bearers with skill. The last act unfolded step by step, remembered in tablets and later laments with the clarity born of loss. Ishbi-Era seized Isin and moved as a king without title, swearing loyalty to the house. He secured Nippur's rights and priesthood. He wrote to Ibisin of prices and shortages, asking freedom to guard the main cities. Meanwhile, the Elamites, under a king named Kindatu, moved west with allies from towns tired of Ur's dues. They cut the ways between capital and provinces. They took the great storehouse at Puzrish Dagan. They seized the harbors that fed the royal granaries. The crown could no longer promise that a ration granted in one place would be given in another. That was the moment empire became city with long memory. The fall of Ur came in the year that later tradition fixed around 2004 BC. The assault was heavy and direct. The walls raised under Ur-Nammu and perfected under Shulgi could not stand against men who had already stripped the provinces. The city fell. Flame climbed the terraces of the Ziggurat. The gates of the gods were broken. The royal house was taken. Ibisin was led in chains east to Elam. The ruin was remembered in a cycle of songs the Sumerian singers called laments. In the lament for Ur, the goddess Ningal speaks of pleading for her city and of refusal. The god Nana, it is said, sailed away from the city in his heavenly boat. The texts are theology, but also a catalogue of real wounds. Temples shattered, granaries burned, canals choked with rubble. The laments name quarters street by street and weep for them. A guide of grief, written by those who counted every threshold. Archaeology confirms it. In Ur and other southern cities, the late levels of the Third Dynasty bear fire scars, burnt brick, smashed jars, layers of mud brick hardened by flame. Tablets break off mid-series.
Seals that once marked wool and oil deliveries appear for the last time. Houses rise smaller on the ash. In places, skeletons lie under the dust where they fell. The end was not one night, but the sack of the capital told the south the gods had turned away. Afterward, the Elamite army went home with captives and loot. Kindatu did not make the city his capital. His victory broke the system more than it built anew. Ishbi-Era took the empty place. He founded his dynasty in Essene and declared he had driven the Elamites out of the south. He seized Nippur's rights and gave his titles old names. Other towns did the same. In Larsa, a house rose within a generation, beginning its own tribute tablets. The map, once one color under Shulgi, grew mottled again. The language of tablets remained Sumerian in schools and laws, but Akkadian and Amorite names grew common in witness lists and soldier rolls. The change began before the fires had gone out. Ur's fall was politics and economy. Climate set the stage. From the late 3rd millennium, the fields grew salty, for irrigation draws salt to the surface if water is led unwisely for centuries. Farmers shifted from wheat to barley, more salt-hardy. Yields fell in the districts despite strict schedules. In the north, drought a century before the fall drove people south in search of bread. The canal web held under stress while the court was strong. It could not hold when provinces began to keep grain back. Armies do not march with empty granaries. Walls are not mended if brick burners go unpaid. Law weakens when silver, that underwrites fines and rations, is spent faster than weighed back. The end of Ur was the end of Sumerian rule as a living force, yet it did not erase Sumerian culture. The laments were copied in schools for centuries. Nippur's rites endured. The language of learning stayed Sumerian, though the streets spoke Akkadian. The power to gather every town of the south for a canal cleaning and to live by one calendar was gone. In its place rose rival houses that fought for a century until a new prince of Babylon gathered them and wrote his name into law. After Ur's fires cooled, the south did not fall silent. It spoke with new voices that kept the old words. The political map split into courts at Essene and Larsa. Ishbi-Era in Essene seized Nippur's rights and named himself king of Sumer and Akkad. In Larsa, a line including Gungunum and later Rim-Sin anchored itself along the lower Euphrates, drawing merchants in herds. For a century, two houses struggled. Cities changed allegiance. Canals opened and closed to trap enemy boats. When Hammurabi of Babylon took Larsa in 1763 BC, and soon after Essene, the struggle ended. Babylon stood eldest. The end of the Sumerians as a ruling people came not in one conquest, but in slow shift, where Amorite dynasties took the palaces the Sumerians had built. The language shows the same change in the tablets of Essene and Larsa. Witness lists filled with Akkadian and Amorite names, letter grammar Akkadian. Yet law and hymn still sounded Sumerian, recopied by students learning both tongues. Scribes still began in the tablet house with the old lists of trades, trees, birds, fish, and stones. Still drilled the systems of measure and land set in the late 3rd millennium. Still copied Sumerian proverbs and model contracts. The goddess Nisaba remained the patroness of writing.
Sumerian literature survived precisely because the language itself vanished from common speech. When a tongue becomes the voice of ritual and scholarship, it is guarded with special care. In the Old Babylonian age, scholars of Nippur and Uruk gathered and retold the old Sumerian tales. The poems of Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and Huwawa were copied and recited, even as they grew into a grand Akkadian epic. Hymns to Inanna and Enlil were recopied with notes for the singers. The laments over ruined cities were preserved, both in the general tongue of the south and in the special Emesal dialect for temple singers. Scribes compiled lexical lists in long series, matching Sumerian with Akkadian words. Later generations named one such series Urukagina. Whoever mastered it could read temple tablets and serve at court. Religion kept the old speech alive. The lamentation priests who sang Balag and Ashmer songs did so in Sumerian, even in the first millennium. Ritual instructions for sacrifice, for rebuilding shrines, and for divination continued to be written in the ancient tongue. When Assyrian kings far to the north rebuilt the Temple of Enlil in Nippur, they dedicated gifts with Sumerian titles above Akkadian lines, a gesture that acknowledged the south as mother of craft. Even when Nabu became the god of scribes, school lists still began with Sumerian columns. Economy and settlement changed their shape while the words still lived. The southern canals kept wandering. The Euphrates shifted east, then west, leaving great cities without the water that once fed them. In the late Babylonian age, Uruk lost power when the river withdrew. At Eridu, life thinned and fell silent for long years. Ur remained a sacred center, but never regained the crowds of the Third Dynasty. Northward, new towns grew along the routes that favored Babylon, then Sippar and Marad. The south did not empty, but it no longer led by numbers, as in the age of Uruk. Clay archives reflect the shift. The vast institutional records, like those of Puz-Rish Dagan, ended with Ur's fall. In their place appeared the records of merchant houses and local officials, showing a looser economy where private credit and land trade counted most. The long ecological story did not end in one disaster. Irrigation always drew salt up to the surface. The Third Dynasty had managed the risk with strict schedules and careful rotation of crops and herds. When central control collapsed, some regions fell back to barley alone, and lower yields became part of life. Further north, rain-fed farming suffered under drier skies in the fall of Akkad and again in later centuries. These shifts drove people along canals and roads toward stronger places. Tablets listing runaways and resettlers are not sermons, but records of land that could no longer feed all the mouths once counted in its tax rolls. Ideas and titles traveled with the people. Babylonian kings adopted the title King of Sumer and Akkad to claim the full heritage of the plain. The long code of Hammurabi was written in Akkadian, but its form grew from earlier Sumerian practice. The prologue declares divine gift of royal power. Laws stand line by line with numbers. Fines are set by class of person and by type of injury. The habit of making justice public and lasting in clay was Sumerian, even when the words were Akkadian. Later Assyrian and Babylonian lords gathered Sumerian hymns and rites for their libraries. When the royal scribes of Nineveh filled shelves for Ashurbanipal's palace, many tablets were copies of Sumerian works already recopied for centuries and to be recopied for centuries more. School preserved the thread. School tablets from Nippur of the second millennium show a program shaped with care, from simple sign lists to complex bilingual glossaries and model hymns. Colophons on some tablets give the name of the pupil, the name of the master, and the day. These human notes reveal that the young scribe was learning to write Sumerian lines he never spoke at home. He learned them because courts and temples still used them, and because one who knew them could serve a governor, a merchant house, or a king.
Archaeology added its own voice to the echo. Excavations at revealed rebuildings after the sack and a chain of temples from the Isin and Larsa ages that still served Nana. At Larsa, the temple of the sun god shows building stages under Rim-Sin. At Isin, bricks stamped with the names of Ishbi-Era and his successors show that these rulers repaired walls and cleared canals in the old style while seeking Nippur's favor. Kilns and workshops in these cities bear witness that craft did not cease with political defeat. In the cemeteries, the grave goods show a blend of old Sumerian forms and new fashions from Amorite courts. The world had changed, yet not shattered into parts that could no longer speak to each other. The end of Sumerian as a spoken language likely came in the early 2nd millennium. After that date, it lived as Latin later lived in Europe, as the tongue of sacred rites and scholarly books. Bilingual tablets from the 1st millennium at Assur and Babylon proved that priests and scholars still studied it and used it to title their works. A Babylonian astronomer, writing a clay ephemeris, might read a hymn in Sumerian and explain its lines in Akkadian to his student. The line stretching from barley field at Eridu to the scribe at Babylon sketching planets on clay was not straight, yet unbroken. The Sumerians did not vanish, they were absorbed. Their gods gained new names or kept the old with a new speech. Their law spoke Akkadian words, yet in familiar forms. Their reckoning of hours, degrees, and measures needed no translator. Their schools trained generations of strangers to draw their signs. Their cities lost power, then people, yet their tales passed into other homes and were received there. The echo faded in the streets and grew stronger in libraries. Looking back from the ages of Babylon and Assyria, we still see Sumer's outline beneath the later layers. A temple on a high terrace, a city that thought in tablets, a law set above the will of man because it stood inscribed. The habit of reckoning time by the moon and dividing circle and hour into 60 parts were stones later builders never removed. They built upon them and called the house by a new name. The Sumerians built not only cities, they built habits that outlived their walls. In the land between the rivers, they turned water into law, clay into memory, and number into a language that still orders our days. When later kings spoke of rule over the 4 quarters of the world, they stood on Sumerian ground, knowing it or not.
Begin with the city. Sumerian cities grew from temple houses into full civic organisms. Tripartite temples rose along a clear axis. Facades with buttresses and niches caught the light. Platforms climbed in layers until they became ziggurats, faced with fired brick and bound with bitumen. The great terrace at repaired and enlarged by generations, was only the most famous heir of a form first tested at Eridu and Uruk. Around the Sacred Heart stretched storehouses, courtyards, workshops, and docks on the canals. Quays brought reed and timber from the north, copper from the east, and stone from the highlands where clay was scarce. The street plan learned the grammar of alleys and courts that gave shade and drove air. Houses followed standard plans with reception halls, side rooms, brick drains, and jars set in the floor to cool oil and beer. The city was no accident, but a pattern repeated until habit became culture. The temple economy taught the world how to govern scale. Fields and herds belonged to the god and were leased to dependents on terms set in clay. Weaving rooms turned temple wool into cloth under the eyes of overseers. Brewers and bakers took measured barley and returned tallied jars and loaves. The famous beveled rim bowl of the Uruk age was the poor man's archive of this order, a standard ration in the palm. Cylinder seals rolled feasts and battles across damp clay, certifying rations and receipts. Bullae with tokens gave way to tablets with numbers and then to full writing, so that the storehouse might remember more than a steward's head. With writing came schools. The tablet house taught boys to cut neat wedges, to copy lists of trades, plants, and stones, to count capacities and draft contracts. From there, school carried the first literature, the first hymns, the first proverbs, and the first mathematics that survived in steady tradition. Sumerian writing began as pictures and became signs pressed by a trimmed reed. By the late 4th millennium BCE, tablets from Uruk recorded barley and beer, fish and cloth, as well as the rations of workers whose names were drawn sometimes as pictures, sometimes as sounds. Writing fixed into wedge form and became an instrument that could write Sumerian, Akkadian, and any language ready to learn its signs. In the following centuries, scribes compiled dictionaries where Sumerian words matched Akkadian, preserved long sign lists, and set technical terms for law and cult. The habit of writing outlived the language that bore it. Long after Akkadian filled the streets, the school still taught thought in Sumerian categories. For this reason, Sumerian literature and law were recopied for 1,000 years. Number was the second pillar. The Sumerians favored the count of 60, more generous than 10 suggested by the fingers. The sexagesimal made inverses easy and encouraged the making of tables of products and measures that ran smoothly from grain to land to time. Capacity was reckoned from the sila as the basic bowl, gathered into great units like the gur. Lengths were measured by cubits and cords. Land was measured in squares, such as the Iku field. This same base gave the measure of time. Months followed the moon and were fitted to the seasons by intercalation. Hours and circles divided neatly into 60 parts, so that a scribe with line and eye could measure a field, set a levy, or reckon a right. Later ages took over the hour and the circle entire, so that wristwatches still speak Sumerian without knowing it. Law was the third pillar. For centuries, custom and oath bore justice. Then rulers began to proclaim reforms and fix rulings in clay. The reforms of Urukagina at Lagash curbed the small thefts of office. The Code of Ur-Nammu at Ur set fines for bodily injuries and thefts, gave rules for marriage and divorce, and punished slander with silver rather than blood where possible. Court sat at the temple gate. Judges heard witnesses. Seals were rolled. Contracts named adopters and adopted, creditors and debtors, buyers and sellers with terms, penalties, and curses on breakers. When a ruler proclaimed reform, he built the tablet into the wall so that any man might point to it. The thought that law could stand above the will of the ruler because it was written is one of Sumer's gifts, guarded jealously by later dynasties. Technology followed need, then outran it. Farmers used the ard plow and the cedar plow that dropped seed straight into the furrow. Oxen drew them across wet soil in the proper week of the month. Irrigation canals, feeder ditches, and drains were dug, lined, and managed so that barley might drink but not drown, and salt not rise too fast. Reed boats smeared with bitumen ran the rivers and marshes. The fast potter's wheel turned out hundreds of bowls. Masons made plano-convex bricks for speed and fired bricks for strength. Smiths worked copper, then bronze. Carpenters dressed cedar from the west into beams for halls. The wheel first served the potter, then carts and war chariots drawn by onagers, long before true horses became familiar in these lands. When a city standardizes tools and measures, craft multiplies in every quarter. Sumer also gave the first lasting literature. The Epic of Gilgamesh grew from Sumerian lays into the great Akkadian poem. But the scribes who pressed the tablets owed their skill to the first texts of Uruk. And Hedwana, daughter of Sargon and priestess at Ur, composed hymns to Inanna that formed the voice of prayer for centuries.
Sumerian laments for ruined cities preserved memory of loss and taught later courts to pray when gods seemed far. Proverbs gathered in schools taught that a clay pot cannot contend with a copper jug, and that a word can build or break a house. Arts and music joined word. The royal cemetery yielded lyres with golden bull heads and lapis, mosaics of shell and red stone, and the standard with scenes of war and feast. The board game we call the Game of Ur traveled far from the south and is still played by rules recovered from later tablets. Religion gave the frame of power. Every city belonged to its god, who received daily bread and beer, and granted legitimacy to rulers serving his sanctuary. Enlil at Nippur remained the arbiter of rank. Nana at measured the month and blessed merchants setting out to sea at the river's mouth. Inanna at Uruk made kings bold in war and radiant in festival. Enki of Eridu ruled wisdom and fresh water, and the rites that began in the reeds above the springs. The pantheon explained and strengthened order. To move a boundary stone was to insult a god. To falsify a weight was to cheat a god. To swear lightly was to call down trial by ordeal. The temple calendar bound labor into a sacred cycle so that canal clearing, harvest, and sacrifice marched together through the year. Their science began with sky and field. Priests and scholars of Sumer tracked the moon, marked first risings of bright stars, and knew the seasons that aided sowing and reaping. Names of stars in later lists lead back to Sumerian words. The plow shines in spring. The bull stands in the season of flood. Texts of omens began as exact notes. What follows what? When the moon was thin and pale, the flood was weak. When a halo formed around the moon, wind would come. Such records grew into libraries of signs that later astronomers and diviners studied with true rigor. Medicine and healing rites appear in early tablets as recipes of herbs and as spells against fever. In both, a craft was formed that could be taught and passed on. Trade was a net the Sumerians cast across deserts and seas. Dilmun stood as partner and station in the Gulf. Magan sent copper. Lands called Meluha in later texts likely marked the Indian world, whose carnelian and wood reached the south. Caravans moved along rivers and mountain slopes. Boats hugged coasts and crossed to islands. Merchants carried tablets with seals that opened gates and eased tolls. Weights made a mina in equal to one in Susa or Mare. The temple did not manage every bargain, but it set the frame in which private profit could flourish. Even games and burials hold primacy. The royal cemetery gave our age a vision of the third millennium court. The tomb of Queen Puabi held gold and lapis ornaments of wondrous craft. Lyres, chariots, carved vessels, and the bodies of attendants who died to follow their mistress. These finds stand as stern witnesses of wealth, court music, banquet rites, and a service that asked the last gift. Game boards from the same soil show racing tracks inlaid with shell, copied for generations. Small things travel through time with ease. A game that pleased a Sumerian prince may still delight us today. Gather all these strands and the pattern shows. The Sumerians built the first cities we can walk in thought with certainty. They made the first archives where a stranger could learn a dead man's debts and a steward's pride. They set the first laws where justice might serve the poor as well as the rich. They taught the world to count in ways that matched the heavens. They filled courts with music and shelves with stories. Even when their speech faded, their habits stayed. Southern lands passed from Sumerian kings to Amorites and beyond, but their houses stood on Sumerian ground. The Sumerians left the stage, but their voices remained behind the curtain and fed the lines of later actors. Even gods took new names yet kept old duties. Inanna of Uruk became Ishtar in Akkadian and kept the powers of love, war, and royal grace. Enki of Eridu became Ea and kept the fresh waters of the deep and wise counsel that saved cities at the last hour. Nana of Ur became Sin, lord of the moon and keeper of months. Utu of Sipar and Larsa became Shamash and kept the measure of light and justice. Enlil of Nippur, to whom Sumerian kings went for rank, remained Ilil in Akkadian prayers and confirmed thrones. When Babylon rose, its priests wove the old powers into new theologies without breaking the chain. Creation myths we called Babylonian stood on Sumerian Kempel cosmologies. Rituals that led the year from sowing to harvest carried Sumerian lines word for word in the mouths of priests who spoke Akkadian at home. The literary tradition walked the same road. Sumerian songs of Gilgamesh were copied in schools long after the tongue fell silent in streets. From them grew the Akkadian epic, known from tablets in Nineveh and elsewhere. Its 11th tablet tells of a flub and a wise survivor who received secret warning, sealed a boat with bitumen, saved seeds in skills, and tested the waters with birds. That tale stands beside the Sumerian-Akkadian Atrahasis cycle and bears clear kinship to the flood in Genesis. This kinship is no guess. Cuneiform fixed the lines long before alphabet, and the parallels read line by line. Another echo is the legend of Sargon. A child set adrift on a river and raised to greatness returns in the story of Moses. In both, an ancient Mesopotamian motif entered later scriptures through memory and teaching. Law kept Sumerian form even when new dynasties wrote in Akkadian. The Code of Ur-Nammu set a model, a prologue granting power from high gods, rules laid in plain lines, punishments set by class and act. Later rulers of Isin and Babylon wrote their codes in the same frame. Lipit Ishtar of Isin gave laws that bridged Ur-Nammu's code and Hammurabi's long Akkadian text. Courts still sat at temple gates. Witness lists still framed each case. Oaths were still sworn by gods whose statues stood in halls where bricks bore Sumerian signs. Education kept the language alive. In the first millennium BC, when Assyrian kings built libraries and Babylonian scholars filled them, scribes trained on lexical lists where Sumerian columns stood beside Akkadian translations. The great series of dictionaries beginning with Urra, Habulu, is a monument of that work. Priests of lament still use the Sumerian liturgical dialect Imasal. Balag hymns and lament songs sounded in the old tongue when a city mourned or a king sought a sign. A scribe of Ashurbanipal could copy a Sumerian hymn in the morning and count silver in Akkadian by noon, without feeling he had crossed into another world. The mind raised on this soil learned from its first tablet to live bilingually. The cities of Sumer became shrines and memories where later kings sought their share of antiquity. Nabonidus of Babylon in the 6th century BC rebuilt in Ur the Great Terrace of Sin. He dug to old foundations, read names of ancient kings on buried bricks, and set his daughter as high priestess of the moon god's house, an office echoing Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon, who wrote hymns at Ur. Assyrian kings rebuilt the Akur at Nippur and left gifts inscribed in both Sumerian and Akkadian to honor Enlil. When a monarch wished to seem ancient, he did not invent a new god, but sought a Sumerian temple and carved his name on its threshold. Astronomy and divination carried Sumerian habits and names. Star lists in later libraries hold Sumerian constellations, once used in temple calendars. The plow rises in spring. The bull stands in flood season. Priests track the moon across the sky, divided by 60. Their tables of months and intercalation rules grew from Sumerian calendars that set canal clearing and festivals. The same scholars who wrote omen texts from livers or skies taught Sumerian names of planets and stars, for the heavens were first named in Sumer. Trade networks bore the old order forward even as palaces changed hands. Dilmun kept its role in the Gulf. Magan still sent copper by sea. Lands called Meluaha in Akkadian texts still gave carnelian and wood. Standard Sumerian weights and vessels remained accepted by merchants writing contracts in Akkadian or later in Aramaic. A mina of silver on scales needed no translation. A cylinder seal pressed on wet clay remained a signature outlasting its owner. Archaeology of our age gave the Sumerians faces and streets. For centuries, Greeks and Romans knew Babylon and Nineveh, but not Sumer. The name Sumer returned in the 19th century when scholars read the script and saw a language older than Akkadian. First steps in reading cuneiform were made by George Grotefend in 1820. The leap came when Henry Rawlinson in the 1830s-40s copied the trilingual inscription at Behistun. In the 1840s-50s, Austin Henry Laird uncovered Assyrian palaces. In 1872, George Smith read the flood tale from the 11th tablet of Ashurbanipal's library before a stunned London. The land of Sumer itself spoke soon after. From the 1870s, Ernest de Sarzec brought statues from Girsu. Teams from the University of Pennsylvania cleared Nippur and found schools and temple rooms packed with tablets. Leonard Woolley in the 1920s-30s worked at and revealed the royal cemetery with lyres, gold, and the untouched tomb of Queen Puabi. He also found a layer of river silt he took for the Great Flood, a find later scholars wove into a more complex picture of many floods. At Eridu, Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd traced temple after temple back to the first shrines. Each trench and tablet turned rumor into record. Museums filled with the breath of ancient cities. From the Iyana temple at Uruk came the Warka vase with its procession of gifts and a marble face once inlaid with color. From Lagash came the steel of the vultures with ruler Eyanatum and grim detail of war. From storehouses came simple beveled bowls that fed workers and showed archaeologists the shape of mass production. From schools came student tablets where crooked wedges of a learner stand beside a teacher's steady hand. Sumer moved from legend into textbook. Their legacy rooted itself more quietly. Words themselves traveled. Akkadian kept Sumerian borrowings for fields, offices, and tools. Later, Aramaic inherited terms from Akkadian that had begun in Sumer. Sounds shifted, but categories stayed. A city was still a temple economy with fields, stores, and quays. Whether in Sumerian, Akkadian, or Aramaic, a ruler still sought blessing at Nippur or Babylon before taking the title King of Sumer and Akkad. A scribe still learned tables of 60 before serving at court. In the end, the Sumerians remained as foundation. Their cities taught heirs to raise clay to the horizon. Their schools taught courts that a promise on clay could judge one who never met the plaintiff. Their laws taught kings that justice could bear a prologue and list and bind even the ruler. Their numbers taught astronomers to count the steps of the moon. Their songs taught poets to speak of friendship and loss with a voice heard 3,000 years. Modern readers met them late and learned that part of their own house was older than they thought. When George Smith read the floodlines, he did not awaken a dead world. He heard the oldest part of his own tradition.
When Wuli lifted a lyre with a golden bowl, he not only opened a royal tomb, he found a court where music had duties. Bread and beer were measured, and a steward pointed to a brick and named the king who laid it. The echo that began in the reed house of Eridu passed through Babylonian schools, Assyrian libraries, Persian satrap records, notes of Greek travelers who knew not the old name, and on to scholars' notebooks and museum halls. So the first civilization endures across ages, not only by dynasties of kings or a single city, but by habits other peoples adopted because they worked. A calendar that matched canals and harvest, writing that held contracts so tightly liars could not slip free, a measure that suited barley, beer, and time, a song that taught courage and grief to any who listened. The Sumerians gave these to the world, and the world still uses them.